The dust kicked up by the horses' hooves settled slowly over the arid plains of Oklahoma. Caleb, a man carved from the same rough-hewn landscape as his surroundings, rode with a quiet, practiced ease. His face, weathered by sun and sorrow, was a map of a life lived hard. A thick, dark beard framed a mouth that rarely smiled, and his eyes, a startling blue against his tanned skin, held a depth of loneliness that had become his constant companion since the fever took his wife, Sarah, and their young son, Jacob, 2 years ago. His ranch a few miles west was a testament to his grief. The fences were mended, the barn was sturdy, and the cattle were well fed, but the house felt hollow. Every room echoed with the silence of a life that was supposed to be filled with the laughter of a boy and the gentle hum of a wife. He worked from sun-up to sundown, not for ambition or profit, but to tire his body enough that his mind would stop its relentless replay of memories. This afternoon he was on his way back from the nearest town, a small dusty outpost called Harmony Creek, where he'd gone to buy supplies. The small town was more a collection of shacks and a general store than a true community, and Caleb preferred to keep his visits brief. People there knew his story, and their well-meaning pity felt like a fresh wound every time. He'd loaded sacks of flour, coffee beans, and sugar onto his horse and was now making his way back, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. As he rode, a faint, unnatural scent reached him, carried on the dry wind. It was the acrid smell of burning wood, but mixed with something else, something sour and unpleasant. He reined in his horse, Blackwood, and squinted toward the horizon. A thin plume of smoke twisted into the clear air, rising from a small, dilapidated shack tucked away in a gully he'd never paid much attention to. He knew the land well. This was an old trapper's cabin, abandoned for years, or so he thought. Curiosity, a feeling he hadn't indulged in for a long time, pricked at him. He steered Blackwood off the main trail and toward the gully. The closer he got, the stronger the smell became, and he could now hear a faint sound, a low, rhythmic thudding, followed by a child's whimpering. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He dismounted quietly, leaving Blackwood tied to a sturdy mesquite tree. He drew his pistol, a well-oiled Colt Peacemaker, and held it low, his movements silent and deliberate. The shack was in a worse state than he'd imagined. The roof sagged, the windows were broken, and the front door hung askew on a single hinge. Through one of the cracked windows, he saw a scene that made his blood run cold. A man, large and unkempt, was stumbling around the single room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey clutched in his hand. He was shouting curses, his words slurred and ugly. On the dirt floor, 2 small figures were huddled in a corner, their bodies trembling. The man lurched forward, kicking a small wooden stool that splintered against the wall. "Useless brats, couldn't even fetch me a decent meal," he bellowed, his voice thick with rage and alcohol. The smaller figure, a boy no older than 6, let out a terrified cry. The larger one, a girl who looked to be 10 or 11, pulled her brother closer, shielding him with her small body. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. The pain and fear he saw on the children's faces were a raw, visceral thing, echoing the helplessness he'd felt when he lost his own family. He wasn't one to interfere in other people's business, but this wasn't business. This was a man abusing 2 defenseless children. He couldn't turn away. The memory of Jacob's bright eyes and Sarah's loving smile filled his mind, fueling a surge of protective fury he hadn't felt in years. He moved to the front door, his hand steady despite the tremor of anger running through him. He kicked it open with a loud splintering of wood. The man inside froze, the bottle dropping from his hand and shattering on the floor. His bloodshot eyes widened in surprise, and then narrowed with aggression. "Who the hell are you?" the man snarled, wiping a hand across his mouth. Caleb's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "Get away from them." The man, clearly not used to being challenged, puffed out his chest. "This ain't none of your business, cowboy. These are my kids." "Not anymore," Caleb said, his eyes fixed on the man. The children, startled by his sudden appearance, peeked out from behind the girl's trembling form, their faces smudged with dirt and tears. He kept his pistol pointed at the man, a silent, unwavering threat. "Leave this place. Now." The man's bravado faltered. He saw the cold resolve in Caleb's eyes and the steady aim of his gun. He let out a frustrated grunt, kicking a piece of broken furniture before stumbling out of the shack, muttering threats under his breath as he disappeared into the gathering dusk. Caleb lowered his weapon, his gaze softening as he knelt down, careful not to make any sudden moves. The girl, her hair a tangled mess, held her brother so tightly their small bodies seemed to be one. She looked at Caleb with a mixture of fear and defiance, her eyes old beyond her years. "It's all right," he said, his voice a soft rumble. "He's gone. You're safe now." The girl didn't speak, but she slowly loosened her grip on her brother. The boy, Leo, looked up at Caleb, his face streaked with tears and dirt, his eyes wide and innocent. "Are you an angel?" he whispered, his small voice barely audible. Caleb felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he'd almost forgotten. He managed a small, tired smile. "No, son, just a cowboy." He reached out a hand, not to touch them, but as an offer. The girl hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his for any hint of deceit. Finally, she nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his presence. This small gesture was the first step. He knew this was not going to be easy. He had no plan, no idea what to do next. All he knew was that he could not leave them here. As the last light faded from the sky, a new and unexpected purpose began to stir within the desolate emptiness of his heart. Caleb stayed crouched, his presence a quiet, immovable comfort in the smoky, miserable shack. The air, thick with the smell of stale alcohol and the acrid scent of wood smoke, was a nauseating cocktail that clung to everything. The girl, whose name he still didn't know, kept a wary eye on him, her small body still tense, coiled like a frightened rabbit. The boy Leo clung to his sister, his face buried in her tattered dress, a small trembling bundle of silent fear. A single kerosene lamp flickered, its light a feeble protest against the encroaching darkness. It cast long, dancing shadows that made the already grim room feel even more menacing, turning the rough-hewn walls into a canvas of shifting ghosts. "What's your name?" Caleb asked gently, his voice low and calm, a soothing balm in the tense silence. He made sure to keep his hands visible, an open gesture of peace, a silent promise that he meant them no harm. The girl hesitated for a long moment before answering, her voice a reedy whisper, barely audible above the crackle of the dying fire. "Maya, and this is Leo." She looked at him, her gaze sharp and assessing, an old soul trapped in a child's body. "Why did you help us?" "You needed help," Caleb replied simply, the truth of it echoing in the quiet room. "Are you hurt?" Maya shook her head, but her eyes darted to a fresh bruise on her arm, a dark splotch against her pale skin, a recent memory of pain. He saw a similar mark on Leo's cheek, a small, fading reminder of a past blow. His jaw tightened, and a wave of a familiar, bitter anger washed over him, a cold fury that reminded him of the helpless rage he had felt when his own family had been taken from him. He pushed it down, focusing on the immediate need. "Do you have any food?" he asked, his gaze sweeping the room. The shelves were bare, a testament to a long and painful hunger. A small rusted pot in the corner held nothing but a few scraps of burnt grain, a meager, pathetic meal. The children's thin frames told him all he needed to know. They were starving, their small bodies a silent scream of neglect. Maya's stomach rumbled, a pathetic sound that was both a plea and a confession. She looked away, her face burning with shame, her small shoulders hunched in on themselves. Caleb stood up slowly, a deliberate movement to avoid startling them. "I have some supplies on my horse, flour, coffee, some sugar. I can make something." He went outside and returned with a small satchel, the cool, fresh air a momentary relief. He pulled out a tin of hardtack and a canteen of water. "It's not much, but it'll do for now." He broke a few pieces of the hardtack and offered them to the children. Maya took a piece for herself, and then, with a profound gesture of love, gave the rest to Leo, who devoured it as if it were a feast. Her act of selflessness, a small but profound gesture, struck him deeply. It was a sign of the deep bond between them, a lifeline in their desperate existence. Caleb found a usable cast-iron skillet near the fire pit and began to prepare a simple meal. He mixed flour and water to make a thin paste, adding a pinch of sugar. It was a meager effort, but the smell of it cooking over the small dying fire seemed to fill the shack with a fragile sense of hope, a warm, comforting aroma that promised a better future. While he worked, he spoke to them in a low, soothing voice, telling them about his ranch, about the cattle and the wide-open spaces, about the long, quiet days. He didn't ask them about their father, sensing it was a topic best left untouched for now. "I have a good horse," he said, turning the skillet. "His name is Blackwood. He's a good partner. He knows the land better than I do sometimes." Leo, emboldened by the small meal and Caleb's gentle demeanor, finally spoke up, his voice still a whisper, a small, fragile sound. "Is your horse very big?" Caleb smiled, a genuine, if rusty, smile that reached his eyes. "He is. Strong, too. He's the fastest horse in the county." He served the food on 2 clean pieces of cloth he had in his satchel. The children ate slowly at first, as if afraid to believe it was real, then with a ravenous hunger that pained Caleb to watch. They finished every last morsel, their eyes full of a gratefulness that transcended words. When the last bit was gone, Caleb sat back against the wall, watching them. The full meal, meager as it was, seemed to have settled some of the fear in them. Leo's eyes began to droop, and he leaned his head against Maya's shoulder, a small sigh of contentment escaping his lips. "He sleeps a lot," Maya said, noticing Caleb's gaze. "He gets tired from being hungry." Caleb nodded, his heart aching with a profound sadness. "I understand." He knew they couldn't stay here. The shack was a death trap, a monument to their father's cruelty and neglect. Their father would likely return, full of even more rage. "My ranch is not far from here," he said carefully, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. "You'll be safe there. I have a spare room, food, a proper bed." Maya's eyes narrowed with suspicion, her face a mask of mistrust. "Why?" she asked again, her voice firmer this time. "Why would you do that?" He looked into her eyes, seeing the ghost of the same suspicion that had resided in his own heart for so long. "Because every child deserves a safe place to sleep," he said, the words coming from a place he hadn't visited in a long time. It was the truth, and it felt like a heavy weight, but also a relief, to finally say it aloud. "I won't hurt you. I just want to help." She held his gaze for a moment, an intense stare that weighed his every word, his every gesture. Finally, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Okay," she said quietly. "But you have to promise he won't come back." "I promise," Caleb said, the weight of the words settling on him, a solemn vow. He knew it was a promise he'd have to fight to keep, but for these 2 children, he would do it. He would do whatever it took to keep them safe. As the night grew deeper, Caleb built up the fire, keeping a watchful eye on the children, a silent guardian in the darkness. He let them rest, their small forms huddled together, finding a fragile security in his presence. For the first time in 2 years, the suffocating silence in his own life felt a little less empty. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril, but tonight, under the vast, star-filled sky, there was a small glimmer of hope, a fragile thread connecting the lonely cowboy to the 2 lost souls he'd stumbled upon. He wasn't just a lone rider anymore, he was a protector, and the long, difficult journey had just begun. The first light of dawn painted the eastern sky a pale grey, a soft, ethereal light that promised a new day. Caleb roused the children, his voice a gentle murmur in the quiet morning. Leo was still deeply asleep, his head heavy on Maya's shoulder, his breathing a soft, steady rhythm. Maya, on the other hand, was already awake, her eyes fixed on the entrance of the shack as if expecting her father to burst through it at any moment. Her small body was still tense, but there was a new kind of alertness in her gaze, a readiness to face the day. "Time to go," Caleb said gently. "We'll be at my ranch before midday." Maya's gaze remained on him, still filled with a quiet distrust, a silent question in her eyes. "What about our things?" she asked, her voice raspy, a sound that held the weight of all their worldly possessions. Caleb's eyes scanned the pitiful contents of the shack. A few tattered blankets, a cracked bowl, and not much else. He pointed to a small, hand-carved wooden horse in the corner, its tail broken off. "Is that yours?" he asked Leo, who was now stirring, his eyes fluttering open to the pale light. Leo's eyes lit up and he nodded, a small, fragile smile on his face. Maya picked it up and held it tight. "It's the only thing that's ours," she whispered, her words aching with a profound sense of loss. Caleb nodded, his heart aching with the weight of their words. "That's all you need to bring, then." He helped them out of the shack. The morning air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief from the stale, smoky air inside. He lifted Leo, whose body was shockingly light, and sat him on Blackwood's saddle in front of him. Blackwood, a stoic and steady horse, didn't flinch, seeming to sense the precious cargo he was now carrying. Maya was hesitant to get on, her fear of the unknown still warring with her desperate need for safety. But the promise of a warm home and a full belly was a powerful motivator. He helped her up and she sat behind him, wrapping her small hands around his waist, her grip surprisingly strong, a small anchor of trust. The journey back to his ranch was a quiet one. The children didn't speak much, simply taking in the world from their new vantage point. Leo pointed at a jackrabbit that darted across their path, his small voice filled with a childlike wonder. "Look, Maya." "It's just a rabbit, Leo," she replied, her voice flat. But even she couldn't hide the subtle shift in her expression, the way her eyes followed the animal as it disappeared into the brush. Caleb knew this was a world they hadn't seen much of, a world beyond the squalor of their shack, a world of open spaces and wild things. As they rode, Caleb found himself looking at the landscape with new eyes. The dusty trails, the prickly pear cacti, the endless expanse of blue sky. They were no longer just the backdrop to his lonely existence. They were a world to be discovered, a world he was now showing to two children who had been trapped in a single room for most of their young lives. They reached the crest of a low hill, and his ranch came into view. The main house, a solid two-story building he had built with his own hands, sat in the center of the property. The barn stood tall and sturdy, and the corrals were filled with his cattle. It was a place of hard work and solitude, but now, with the two small bodies riding with him, it felt different. It felt full. "Is that your house?" Maya asked, her voice laced with an awe she couldn't hide, a profound sense of wonder at the sight of a home that was so complete, so solid. "It is," Caleb replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "We'll be there soon." When they arrived, he helped the children down. The air was filled with the familiar sense of horse and hay, of dry grass and fresh wood. He led them to the house, its front door standing wide open, inviting them in. Inside, the house was clean but stark. The furniture was simple, and there were no photos on the walls, a conscious decision on his part to erase the painful memories of his lost family. Now he regretted it. The sterile neatness felt cold and empty, a stark contrast to the warmth he was trying to create. "You can stay in here," he said, leading them to a small bedroom on the first floor. It was his old office, but he had a spare bed frame in the barn, and he could put it in here later. For now he just spread a few clean blankets on the floor. It was a far cry from a warm, proper bed, but it was cleaner and safer than their old shack, a place of simple, honest comfort. He went to the kitchen and filled a bucket with water from the well outside. He poured some into a basin and set it on a small table. "You can wash up here," he said. "There's soap and fresh towels." Maya looked at the water and then at Caleb, her suspicion returning. "You're just going to leave us here?" "I'm not leaving you," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I'm just going to tend to the horses and then I'll bring you some fresh clothes. My wife's things are still here, they might fit you. And I can find something for Leo." She seemed to accept this, and he left them alone, giving them the privacy they needed. As he walked toward the barn, he felt a strange mix of apprehension and purpose. He had been so focused on survival, on getting through each day, that he hadn't thought about what it meant to live. Now, with two small lives suddenly in his care, he was forced to. He found some of Sarah's old dresses in a cedar chest and a small pair of trousers and a shirt that had belonged to Jacob. When he returned to the house, he found the children had washed, their faces now clean, revealing two beautiful yet solemn children. Maya's hair, once a matted mess, was now a cascade of light brown, and her eyes, once clouded with fear, held a fragile flicker of curiosity. He handed them the clothes. "They might be a bit big, but they're clean," he said. They took the clothes silently, their small hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear. They disappeared into the room, and when they emerged a few minutes later, they looked like different children. The clothes were a bit baggy, but they hung on their frames with a sense of dignity. Maya's dress was a pale blue, and Leo's shirt was a faded, checkered pattern. Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. It was the first time he had seen Jacob's clothes on someone since. He swallowed hard, pushing the painful memories away. This wasn't about the past. This was about the present. This was about a new life, a new purpose. "Come on," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "Let's get you something to eat." He led them to the kitchen, a room he had long associated with sorrow, but now, with the sound of their small footsteps behind him, it felt like a home again. He started a fire in the hearth, a comforting sound that filled the silence. As he began to prepare a proper meal, a simple stew with vegetables and dried meat, he felt a tiny part of the emptiness in his heart begin to fill. The long walk home had been just the beginning. The real journey was just now starting. The quiet calm of the morning, a tranquility that had settled over the ranch like a soft blanket, was shattered by the sound of a horse approaching from the main trail. The rhythmic pounding of hooves on the hard, dry ground was a familiar sound, but this was different. It was loud, chaotic, and filled with a reckless fury. Caleb, who was in the barn mending a saddle, immediately felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He'd told the children he'd be their protector, their shield against the world, and he knew in his gut who was riding up to his land. His instincts, honed by years of a hard life, were screaming a warning. He grabbed his rifle from its spot on the wall and moved toward the house, his strides long and purposeful, his body a coiled spring of readiness. He found Maya and Leo huddled by the kitchen window, their small faces pressed against the glass, their bodies trembling. The fear was back in their eyes, raw and unmistakable. It was the same look of abject terror he had seen in the shack, a look that cut him to the bone. "It's him," Maya whispered, her small body shaking. "He found us." Caleb put a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch a steadying weight. "He hasn't found anything yet. Stay inside. Stay away from the windows." He moved to the front door, his hand steady on the cold steel of the rifle, his jaw set in a hard line. He watched from the doorway as the man from the shack, their father, dismounted his horse. He was an ugly sight, his clothes stained and his face puffy and red from drink, his eyes bleary and filled with a desperate rage. He stumbled toward the house, a bottle of whiskey clutched in his hand, his steps unsteady. "Caleb," he bellowed, his voice slurred and thick with fury, a sound like a wounded animal. "I know you got my kids. Bring 'em out." Caleb stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely but ready, his stance wide and unyielding. "They're not here, Miller," he said, his voice low and firm, a quiet contrast to the man's wild rage. He knew the man's name now from a few conversations in town. It was Jed Miller, a drifter who had a reputation for being a mean drunk and a dangerous fool. Miller stopped a few feet from the porch, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Don't lie to me, Cowboy. I followed your tracks all the way here. They're my kids. You got no right to take 'em." "They were living in a shack, Jed," Caleb said, his voice rising with a controlled anger. "They were starving. You had no right to treat them like that." Miller's face twisted in a sneer. "You don't know nothing about it. They're my blood. They're my responsibility." "A responsibility you've clearly neglected," Caleb retorted, his grip on the rifle tightening. He wasn't afraid of this man, a sad, pathetic drunk, but he was worried about the children. They were inside, terrified, and he had to end this quickly. The longer this went on, the more danger they were in. "I'm taking them back!" Miller roared, taking a stumbling step forward. He reached for a pistol in his belt, but Caleb was faster. "Don't," Caleb said, his voice a lethal whisper. He raised the rifle, the barrel aimed squarely at Miller's chest. The click of the hammer being pulled back was a loud, final sound, a punctuation mark on his threat. Miller froze, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He had been so used to being in control, so used to people fearing him, that the sight of Caleb, a man who clearly had nothing to lose, was a shock. This was not a bluff. This was a man who had already known loss and was now willing to kill to protect what little he had left. "I'm not a lawman, Jed," Caleb said, his voice cold and emotionless. "And I'm not a judge. But I promise you, if you take one more step toward this house, you'll be a dead man. And I'll make sure the authorities know exactly why." The threat hung in the air between them, a tangible weight. Miller, in his drunken state, could see the cold resolve in Caleb's eyes. He could see the truth in the man's stance, in his steady hand. He slowly, reluctantly, took his hand away from his pistol. "You'll regret this, Cowboy," Miller spat, his voice shaking with impotent rage. "I'll be back, and when I do, I'm bringing the law with me." "You do that," Caleb said calmly. "The law will see what you've done to your children, and they'll see that I've given them a home. Now get on your horse and ride, and don't ever come back here again." Miller hesitated for a moment longer, his eyes filled with a simmering hate. Then, with a frustrated growl, he turned and stumbled back to his horse. He mounted with a clumsy motion and rode away, his figure growing smaller and smaller in the distance, until he was just a speck on the horizon. Caleb let out a slow, deep breath, the tension in his body finally releasing. He lowered his rifle and went back inside. He found the children where he had left them, their small faces pale with fear. He knelt down and took their hands in his touch a warm, comforting presence. "He's gone," Caleb said, his voice soft. "He's not coming back. I promise." Maya looked up at him, her eyes wide. "He'll tell the sheriff," she said, her voice a small tremor. "He might," Caleb admitted, "but the sheriff will listen to me. And he'll listen to you. We'll tell him the truth, and we'll be ready for him." He saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, this man was a promise keeper. He pulled them into a gentle embrace, their small bodies feeling so delicate against his own. He held them for a long moment, a quiet gesture of protection. He knew that Miller's threats weren't empty. The law would come, but for now, they were safe. The shadow of their drunken father had passed, but it was not gone for good. It lingered on the horizon, a dark cloud waiting to return, and Caleb knew he had to be ready to fight not just for his own peace, but for the future of these two children who had, in a single day, become his unexpected family. The days that followed Jed Miller's visit were filled with a tense but welcome tranquility, a quiet and fragile peace that was a profound contrast to the chaos of the past. The air, once heavy with the unspoken fear of what Jed might do, was now filled with a sense of purpose. Caleb made good on his promises, his actions speaking louder than any words could. He built a small, sturdy bed for Maya and Leo in the spare room, a simple wooden frame with a soft, clean mattress, a small act of kindness that felt monumental. He found them clean clothes, not just the faded, worn-out ones he had first given them, but new ones he had purchased on a trip to town, a tangible symbol of their new life. He taught them simple chores around the ranch, not as a form of labor, but as a way to give them a sense of purpose and belonging. He showed Maya how to feed the chickens, explaining the different feeds and the subtle rhythms of the coop. He taught Leo how to gather eggs, a task the boy took to with a quiet reverence. The boy, once so withdrawn, now ran around the yard, his face lit up with a joy Caleb hadn't seen in years. He would hold the eggs in his small hands with a reverence that was both heartbreaking and beautiful, as if they were treasures made of porcelain and hope. His laughter, a new and wonderful sound, filled the air, and Caleb would find himself smiling just at the sound of it. Maya, however, remained more reserved. She was still a child, but a part of her was old, and it showed in her eyes. She watched Caleb with an intense, calculating gaze, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to turn into something else. She accepted his help, his food, his home, but she didn't fully trust it. She was polite and helpful, but she kept an emotional distance, a wall she had built up over a lifetime of abuse. Her heart, a fragile and bruised thing, was not yet ready to open up to the possibility of a safe and loving world. Caleb understood. He didn't push her, he just kept showing up. He made sure there was always food on the table, a warm fire in the hearth, and a safe place to sleep. He talked to them about his life, about his wife and son, a painful but necessary truth. He didn't want to hide anything from them. He wanted to show them that he too had known loss and sorrow. He wanted them to know that he was not perfect, but that he was trustworthy. One evening, as they were sitting around the dinner table, the air filled with the quiet comfort of a shared meal, Maya asked him a question that had been on her mind for days. "Did you have kids before?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, a sound that cut through the silence like a knife. Caleb hesitated for a moment, the memories a sharp ache in his chest. "I did," he said, his voice a little thick. "I had a son. His name was Jacob." "What happened to him?" she asked, her curiosity overriding her usual caution. "He got sick," Caleb said, his eyes going distant, the memory of that day as clear and painful as if it had happened yesterday. "A fever. It took him and his mother, my wife, Sarah. They're with the angels now." He looked at Leo, who was staring at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Leo asked me if I was an angel, but I'm just a man who lost his family." The children were silent for a moment, absorbing his words, their small faces a study in contemplation. Then Leo reached across the table and put his small hand on Caleb's, his touch a warm, grounding presence. "You're our angel now," he said simply, his voice filled with a childlike certainty. Caleb's throat tightened, and he felt a lump form in his chest, a powerful mixture of sorrow and gratitude. He looked at Maya, who for the first time was looking at him with a hint of something other than suspicion. It was a fleeting moment, a glimmer of understanding, but it was there, a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. The next morning, as he was heading out to tend to the cattle, he found a small piece of paper on the kitchen table. On it was a crude drawing of a cowboy on a horse, with two stick figures walking beside him, their hands linked. A small note was scrawled on the bottom in a child's uncertain hand. It said, "Thank you." Caleb felt a wave of emotion wash over him, a powerful mixture of gratitude and sorrow. He folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket, a small treasure to be kept close to his heart. It was a sign, a small step in the right direction. It was a sign that the children were beginning to trust him, to see him not as a temporary savior, but as a permanent part of their lives. He rode out to the fields, his mind no longer consumed by his past, but by his present. The sun beat down on his back, the wind whipped through his hair, and the familiar sights of his land felt new and vibrant. He was no longer just a solitary cowboy. He was a guardian, a protector, a father figure. His heart, once a barren wasteland, was beginning to feel a sense of purpose, a quiet warmth that came not from a new beginning, but from the slow, deliberate work of healing. The shadow of Jed Miller was still there, but it was no longer his only focus. For the first time in years, Caleb was looking forward, not back. The day Jed Miller had threatened would eventually arrive. It was a clear, crisp morning, the kind that promised a productive day on the ranch. The air was cool and clean, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Caleb was teaching Leo how to use a rope to practice lassoing a fence post, a lesson in patience and precision. The rhythmic whisper of the rope through the air was a peaceful sound, but it was broken by the sight of two riders approaching from the main trail. One was the local sheriff, a tall, gaunt man named Jim Harding. The other was Jed Miller. Caleb's blood ran cold. He had been preparing for this moment, had run it through his mind 100 times, but seeing it arrive was a different matter. He quickly sent the children inside the house, his voice low and firm. He watched as they disappeared inside, their small figures a picture of fear and obedience. Then he walked to meet the men, his hand resting on his pistol, ready for anything. "Mornin', Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice calm and steady, a powerful facade for the turmoil inside him. Sheriff Harding, a man known for his fairness and his dry sense of humor, nodded a greeting. "Caleb, Jed here says you've been harboring his children against his will." Jed Miller, who looked more sober and a bit more composed than he had on his last visit, spoke up, his voice a sneer of righteous indignation. "They're my kids, Sheriff. He stole 'em from me. I want 'em back." Sheriff Harding looked at Caleb, his expression unreadable. He was a man who had seen both sides of every story, and he was not one to be swayed by emotion. He says you broke into his place and took them. That's not the whole story, Sheriff, Caleb said, his eyes fixed on Miller, a silent challenge in his gaze. He had them living in a shack starving, and he was beating them. He was drunk off his mind. Miller scoffed. He's lying. He wants to steal my family and my land. Is that so? Sheriff Harding said, turning his gaze on Miller, his voice gaining an edge of cold authority. Let me see the house, Jed. I want to see for myself the kind of home you've been providing for your children. Miller's face flushed. What house? It's just an old shack. It's got nothing to do with this. Everything has to do with this, Jed, the sheriff said, his voice hard as stone. You say you're a good father. You say you're a fit parent. I'm going to go see for myself. Caleb offered to take them, but Sheriff Harding refused, saying he knew the way. He told Miller to wait at the ranch while he went to investigate. He gave Miller a long, hard stare. If I find you're lying, Jed, you'll be in a world of trouble. I've got no patience for a man who abuses his own children. As the sheriff rode off, Miller's rage boiled to the surface, a venomous fury that had been simmering beneath his thin facade of civility. You think you're so smart, don't you, Cowboy? He spat. You think you can just take what's mine? You've got another thing coming. They're not yours, Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous, a promise of violence in the sound of it. Not anymore, and I'm not going to let you anywhere near them. The two men stood in a tense standoff, the silence broken only by the sound of the wind whipping through the dry grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Inside the house, Caleb knew the children were listening, their small bodies likely trembling with fear. He had to stand firm. He had to be their protector. He had to be a fortress, a shield against the man who had brought them nothing but pain. After what felt like an eternity, they heard the sound of a horse approaching. It was Sheriff Harding, his face grim, his jaw set in a hard line. He dismounted, and his eyes met Caleb's. He didn't need to say a word. The look on his face told Caleb everything. He had seen the shack, the squalor, the evidence of abuse. He had seen the truth. Sheriff Harding turned to Miller, his face a mask of disappointment and disgust. Jed, I'm putting you in a cell for a long time. You're lucky I don't just leave you out here for the coyotes. I'm taking you to the jail, and I'm not coming back for you anytime soon. Miller's face fell, his bluster gone. He was no match for the law, especially not a lawman who had seen the truth with his own eyes. He protested, he cursed, he pleaded, but his words were empty, hollow. Sheriff Harding led him away, his hands tied behind his back, his body language that of a defeated man. Caleb watched them go, a sense of relief washing over him, a powerful wave that threatened to bring him to his knees. The immediate threat was gone, but he knew this wasn't the end. The law would decide the children's fate, and there was no guarantee they would be allowed to stay with him. But for now, they were safe. He went back inside the house. The children, their faces pale, were standing in the middle of the room, waiting. He knelt down and took their small hands. The sheriff saw everything, he said, his voice trembling a little with emotion. He saw the shack. He saw how you were living. Your father is going to jail. Maya looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. He's gone? For now, Caleb said, his voice firm. You're safe. I promise. He pulled them both into a tight embrace, and for the first time, he felt Maya's small arms wrap around him, a fragile but definite response. The wall she had built around her heart had a crack in it, and in that moment, Caleb knew that his journey wasn't just about saving them from a cruel man. It was about earning their trust, one small quiet moment at a time. The battle was far from over, but for now, they had won the first round. The days after Jed Miller's arrest were a mixture of cautious hope and lingering anxiety, a tense calm before the inevitable storm. The legal process, a world Caleb knew little about, moved with a slow, deliberate certainty. When the summons arrived, a stiff piece of paper sealed with the county's emblem, Caleb felt a weight of responsibility he had never known. He was no longer just a rescuer. He was a key witness, a temporary guardian, and a man fighting for the future of two children who had, against all odds, found a way into his heart. He rode to the nearest town with a courthouse, with Maya and Leo by his side. The children were quiet during the journey, their small hands clutching his, their silence a testament to their fear. They knew, in the way children know things without being told, that this day was a final confrontation with the darkness of their past. The courthouse was a simple one-room building of clapboard and stone, a humble fortress of the law. The air inside was heavy with the scent of old wood and the hushed whispers of the townspeople who had come to witness the proceedings. The judge, a stern-faced but fair man with a shock of white hair, listened to the testimonies with a grim expression, his eyes moving from the witnesses to the accused with a practiced, weary precision. Caleb was the first to speak. He stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice a low, steady rumble as he told the story of how he had found the children. He spoke of the squalor of their living conditions, a hovel of filth and despair. He spoke of the marks of abuse on their small bodies, of the bruises that had seemed to tell a story all their own. He spoke with a quiet passion, his voice filled with a conviction that came from a place of deep, personal experience. When it was Jed Miller's turn to speak, he was a shadow of his former self. He was sober, but his eyes held a cold, venomous glare, a bitter rage that was more terrifying than his drunken fury. He tried to discredit Caleb, calling him a kidnapper and a land-hungry cowboy who had taken his children for profit. He spoke with a sneering arrogance, but his words rang hollow. His story was full of holes, and the judge, a man who had seen it all, could see through his lies as if they were made of glass. The townspeople in the room, some of whom had known Jed Miller as a boy, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces a mixture of disgust and sorrow. Then came the moment Caleb had been dreading. The judge called for Maya and Leo to testify. Leo, his small body a picture of silent fear, was allowed to stay with Caleb. But Maya, her small body trembling, walked to the front of the room, her hand in Caleb's, her eyes fixed on his face as if for strength. She was asked to describe her life with her father. She spoke in a small, reedy voice, a fragile sound that held the weight of a world of pain, but her words were clear and devastating. She spoke of the constant gnawing hunger, of the beatings that came without warning, of the long nights of fear spent huddled with her brother in a corner. She spoke of the day Caleb had found them and of the small acts of kindness he had shown them, the warm food, the clean clothes, the quiet reassurance that they were finally safe. When she finished, the room was silent. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Even the hardened lawmen and townspeople were moved by her testimony, their faces a mixture of sorrow and a profound shared sense of outrage. Leo was spared from having to speak, his small, frail body a silent testament to his sister's words. The judge looked at Jed Miller with a look of pure contempt, a cold, hard glare that could have frozen a river. "Jed Miller," he said, his voice booming in the quiet room, "you are a disgrace. You have forfeited any right to be a father to these children. You will serve 2 years in prison for child abuse and neglect, and you will never be allowed to contact these children again. They are free from you, and from this day forward you will have no place in their lives." Miller's face turned a shade of sickly white. He screamed, he cursed, he threatened, but his words were meaningless. He was dragged away by 2 deputies, his threats swallowed by the thick silence of the courthouse. The judge then turned to Caleb, his expression softening into one of quiet respect. "Mr. Caleb," he said, his voice gentle, "I am awarding you temporary guardianship of these children. I will send a lawman to your ranch every few months to check on them, but for all intents and purposes you are their legal guardian. You have shown a remarkable courage and a good heart. These children are lucky to have you." Caleb could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. He looked at Maya and Leo, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. The fear was gone from their eyes, replaced by a fragile hope, a spark of light in the depths of their souls. He led them out of the courthouse and into the warm sunlight. The journey back to the ranch was different from the one in the morning. The children were no longer silent. They chattered, they laughed, they pointed at the animals and the trees. They were free. As they rode, Caleb felt a new kind of joy, a feeling he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just a rescuer, he was a father. The road ahead would be long and challenging, There would be trials, emotional and physical. But now, with the law on his side, and with two small, hopeful children in his care, Caleb felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer a man lost in the past. He was a man with a future, and for the first time in a very long time, he was looking forward to it. The months that followed the court's decision were a period of slow, profound change, a winter of the heart giving way to a gentle spring. Caleb's ranch, once a place of solitude and quiet grief, was now filled with the sounds of life. There was the constant, reassuring sound of children's laughter, the patter of small feet running across the wooden floors, and the quiet rhythm of a family settling into a new routine. The silence that had once defined his life was now filled with a joyful, beautiful noise. Maya, once so guarded, began to open up like a delicate flower in the sunlight. She started to ask questions, not just about her new life, but about Caleb's past. She asked about Sarah, about Jacob, and about the life he had lived before she and Leo arrived. Caleb, in turn, found himself sharing stories he had kept locked away for years, memories he had thought were too painful to touch. He told her about Sarah's love for gardening, about the way Jacob would chase the chickens around the yard, and about the way they would sit on the porch at sunset, watching the stars, a family of 3 in the vast, open sky. He was not just a man with a past. He was a man with a shared history, and in the sharing the pain of his grief began to lessen. Leo, a child of a few words, expressed his feelings in different ways. He would follow Caleb everywhere, a small, loyal shadow. He would hold his hand as they walked, his small fingers a warm presence. He would sit on his lap in the evenings, his head resting on Caleb's chest as they listened to the crackle of the fire. He would give him spontaneous hugs that were filled with an innocent, uninhibited affection that was a balm to Caleb's weary soul. His small gestures were a testament to a trust that was growing with every passing day. Caleb, for his part, learned to be a father again. He learned to cook not just for 1, but for 3, filling the house with the scent of hearty stews and freshly baked bread. He learned to read bedtime stories in a gentle, calming voice, and to bandage scraped knees and soothe small tears. He learned to listen with his heart, not just his ears, and to read the unspoken needs of 2 children who had been hurt by a world that had been cruel to them. He was not just a provider, he was a protector, a teacher, and a source of unconditional love. The biggest challenge was rebuilding their sense of safety. Maya still had nightmares, waking up with a terrified gasp, her small body trembling with a fear that was a ghost of the past. Leo would sometimes flinch at a raised voice or a sudden movement, his small body recoiling from a memory of a hand that had once brought only pain. Caleb was patient. He would hold them, he would talk to them in a low, calming voice, and he would remind them that they were safe, that they were home, and that no one would ever hurt them again. He was a human shield against the memories that still haunted them. One day, while they were mending a fence, Maya asked Caleb a question that was a sign of how far they had come, a question that was a bridge between their 2 worlds. Do you ever miss them?" she asked, her voice soft. Caleb knew she wasn't talking about her father. She was talking about Sarah and Jacob. He paused his work and looked at her. "Every day," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Every single day." He put his hand on her shoulder. "But having you and Leo here, it helps. It helps me to remember them with joy, not just with sadness. You've given me a new reason to live." Maya looked at him, and for the first time, Caleb saw a glimmer of pure, unadulterated trust in her eyes. She leaned her head against his arm, a silent gesture of affection that was worth more than 1,000 words. The community, once so distant, also began to accept their new family. Neighbors would bring over food, or they would help out with chores, their actions a silent acknowledgement of Caleb's bravery and a testament to their support. The lawman, true to his word, would visit every few months, but his visits were now more like social calls, a friendly check-in with a man who was clearly doing a good job. The ranch, once a place of quiet sorrow, was now a home. It was a place of healing, of hope, and of a future that was being built one small, brave moment at a time. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer the main focus. They were just a part of the story, a testament to the strength and resilience of a cowboy and two children who had, against all odds, found a family. The slow thawing of their hearts was a painful but beautiful process, and Caleb was honored to be a part of it. Life on the ranch, once a landscape of quiet grief and solitary routines, settled into a comfortable, vibrant rhythm. The seasons no longer just marked the passing of time for Caleb. They were now a shared experience, a cycle of work and rest, of sowing and reaping that he lived with Maya and Leo. The stoic, solitary cowboy who had once been defined by his loss was replaced by a gentle, patient father. His hands, once calloused from roping cattle and mending fences, were now just as adept at braiding Maya's hair or teaching Leo how to tie a proper knot. He taught them the language of the land and the animals. He showed Maya how to ride a horse, starting with a gentle mare named Willow, whose movements were as calm and patient as a sunrise. He taught Leo to care for the cattle, explaining the quiet, subtle needs of the herd. The vegetable garden, once a small patch of struggling greens, was now a thriving expanse, and they would spend hours together, their hands in the dirt, planting and weeding and watching as life unfolded from a tiny seed. The children, in turn, brought a sense of light and purpose to his life that he hadn't known since his own family's passing. Their laughter, once a rare and fragile sound, now filled the air with a constant, joyful melody. They would spend evenings by the fire, with the scent of pine and wood smoke filling the air. Caleb, a man who had not touched a book in years, would read stories in a low, calming voice. He would play a simple, heartfelt tune on his harmonica, the music a gentle counterpoint to the crackling fire. The house, once silent and empty, was now filled with the sounds of their lives, the soft murmur of conversation, the quiet rustle of a turning page, the gentle plink of a harmonica. It was a beautiful but fragile piece, a small island of domestic bliss in a vast, uncertain world. One afternoon, as Caleb and Maya were returning from a trip to town for supplies, they saw a woman on horseback waiting by the front gate of the ranch. She was a striking woman, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight like a copper coin, and a kind face that was open and honest. As they approached, she dismounted and walked toward them, her movements graceful and confident. She was a woman who was clearly at home in the world, a stark contrast to the small, wary world Caleb had built for himself and the children. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a soft, melodic sound that was as soothing as a summer rain. "Are you Mr. Caleb?" "I am," Caleb replied, his hand resting on the reins of his horse. He felt a flicker of apprehension. He wasn't used to visitors, especially not ones who seemed to know his name. He was a man who preferred to be alone, and the sudden intrusion into his quiet world was a disconcerting one. "My name is Elizabeth," she said, a small smile gracing her lips. "I'm a teacher. I've heard a great deal about you and your family. I wanted to come by and offer my services." Caleb was taken aback. "Services?" "Yes," she said, her smile widening. "I teach at the school in town, but I've always wanted to reach out to the children who live out here too. I could come by a few times a week and teach Maya and Leo how to read and write. They're at a very important age for learning." Caleb looked at Maya, who was watching the woman with a mixture of curiosity and her usual guardedness. He hadn't even thought about the children's education. He had been so focused on providing them with a safe home and a full belly that he hadn't considered their future in a formal sense. He had been teaching them what he knew, the quiet, practical knowledge of the land, but he knew that was not enough. "That's very kind of you, ma'am," he said, his voice a little hoarse with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "But I don't have much money for a teacher." Elizabeth waved her hand dismissively. "This isn't about money, Mr. Caleb. It's about giving these children a chance at a better life. I heard what you did for them. It's an incredible thing." Caleb was at a loss for words. The kindness of strangers was something he was still learning to accept. He looked at Maya, who was now smiling, a small, genuine smile that lit up her face, a radiant light that Caleb had never seen before. The girl who had once been so afraid of the world was now open to the idea of learning, of a future. "What do you think, Maya?" he asked her, a silent plea in his eyes. Maya's eyes were bright with a newfound hope. "I want to learn, Caleb. Please." Caleb looked at Elizabeth, a grateful smile on his own face. "All right, Miss Elizabeth, thank you. We would be honored to have you." As Elizabeth began to talk to Maya, her voice soft and reassuring, asking her about her interests and her small, fragile world, Caleb watched them. He saw a new kind of hope in Maya's eyes, a light he hadn't seen before. The arrival of Elizabeth wasn't just about an education for the children. It was about a new chapter, a new beginning. It was about a future that was no longer just about survival, but about thriving, about growing, about becoming. The path ahead was still long, and there would be challenges. But as Caleb looked at the small family he had built, and at the kind stranger who was now a part of their story, he knew that they were not alone. They were a family, and they were ready for whatever the future held. The story of the widowed cowboy and the rescued children was not just a story of a rescue. It was a story of hope, of healing, and of the power of a community to come together to help those who need it most. The arrival of Elizabeth brought a new kind of light to Caleb's ranch. Her presence was as calming as a cool creek on a hot day, a quiet strength that filled the air. She was a woman of purpose, and her quiet determination was a powerful force. She began her lessons with Maya and Leo in the mornings, setting up a small table and 2 chairs on the porch when the weather was fair, the morning sun warming their faces. When the air turned cold, they would move inside, to the warmth and light of the hearth. Her teaching methods were gentle and patient, a stark contrast to the harsh, brutal world the children had come from. She didn't rely on a strict curriculum, but on the children's natural curiosity. She would bring worn, dog-eared books with beautiful illustrations and a large slate for writing letters. Maya, with her sharp mind and thirst for knowledge, absorbed everything like a sponge. She learned to form letters with a meticulous grace, her small hand moving with a newfound confidence. Her handwriting soon became neat and precise, a beautiful and tangible sign of her progress. She was a natural reader, her eyes devouring the stories Elizabeth brought, her mind wandering through the worlds within the pages. Leo, on the other hand, was more interested in the pictures than the words. He found a particular fascination with a book on different animals of the West. He would trace the shapes of bears and buffalo with his small fingers, and Elizabeth would sit with him, talking about their habits and sounds. She taught him numbers by having him count the cattle in the fields and the eggs in the henhouse. His laughter, a sound that was once so rare, now filled the air as he proudly counted up to 20, his voice clear and jubilant. Caleb would watch them from a distance, a soft smile on his face. He saw the way Elizabeth's gentle demeanor and encouraging words were chipping away at the children's remaining fear. He saw a part of Maya's heart that he hadn't seen before, a part that was full of a quiet, burning curiosity and a desire for a future beyond her past. He saw Leo's confidence blossom with every correct answer and every shared giggle, a testament to the power of a kind word and a patient heart. His interactions with Elizabeth grew beyond a simple exchange of pleasantries. They would talk over a cup of coffee after the lessons were done, sharing stories about their lives. Caleb found himself opening up to her in a way he hadn't to anyone since Sarah's passing. He talked about his years of loneliness, about the empty ache in his heart. Elizabeth, in turn, spoke of her own journey west, of her dreams of building a schoolhouse for all the children in the area. She was a woman of great purpose, and her passion was infectious. One afternoon, as a gentle rain pattered on the roof, Elizabeth told them a story about a little bird that had lost its home. "And the little bird flew and flew looking for a place where it could be safe," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "It was so tired and so sad, but then it found a great, big tree, a tree with strong branches and a warm, safe nest. And it wasn't alone anymore." She looked at Maya and Leo, and then her eyes met Caleb's. In that brief glance, a silent understanding passed between them. They were all a little bit like that lost bird, and Caleb's ranch, his home, was the tree. As the weeks turned into months, a new kind of routine developed. Elizabeth's visits became a regular part of their lives, a rhythm that was as natural as the sunrise and the sunset. Caleb began to look forward to her visits, to their conversations, to the way the children's faces would light up when she arrived. He found himself dressing with a bit more care, shaving a bit more often. He would find himself thinking about her long after she had gone, about the way her auburn hair would catch the light, about the way her eyes would crinkle at the corners when she smiled. He wasn't sure what this new feeling was, this slow, tentative warmth spreading through his chest. It wasn't the wild, passionate love he had felt for Sarah, but something quieter, something born of respect and shared purpose. It was a feeling of companionship, of a shared path. The children had brought him back to life, and Elizabeth was now helping him find a new kind of joy in it. The ranch was no longer just a place of refuge. It was a home. It was a school. It was a place where a family was being rebuilt, not with blood, but with kindness, with learning, and with a shared sense of hope for a future that was, for the first time in a very long time, beginning to look bright. The scorching heat of summer, which had baked the earth and left the air shimmering above the wide plains, at last gave way to the crisp, clear air of autumn. A gentle coolness settled over the land, a welcome respite that promised the fruits of their labor. The leaves on the few cottonwood trees lining the creek turned brilliant shades of gold and amber, their rustling a soft melody in the breeze. The sky held a clear, deep blue, a vast, open canvas that stretched from horizon to horizon. It was a time of abundance, of final effort and reward. It was harvest time on the ranch, and Caleb, with Maya and Leo's help, was busy with the final roundup of the cattle. The children, now several months into their new life, were no longer just passive inhabitants of the ranch. They were a vital, integral part of its operations, their hands and spirits woven into the very fabric of its existence. Caleb had taught them the rhythms of the land, the language of the animals, and the quiet satisfaction of hard work. Maya, with her innate grace and quick mind, had a natural affinity for horseback. Her movements were fluid and confident, a stark contrast to the small, timid girl he had first found. She would ride alongside Caleb, her horse, a gentle mare named Willow, a perfect match for her temperament. Together they would help to herd the last of the stubborn cattle from the far pastures to the corral, their shared purpose, a silent bond between them. Leo, still too young for a horse, found his purpose on the ground. His small legs would trot tirelessly as he shooed the stray chickens back to their coop, or helped organize the sacks of grain in the barn. He was no longer the frail, silent boy who had been found in the shack, his body thin and his eyes hollow. He was a sturdy, energetic child, whose cheeks were rosy with health and happiness. His small body, once so vulnerable, was now a testament to the nourishment of good food and the warmth of a loving home. Caleb watched them with a quiet, profound pride. He saw the resilience that had been buried deep within them, now blooming into strength. He saw the scars of their past fading, not just on their bodies, but in their eyes. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a clear, bright spark of curiosity and joy. They were no longer victims, they were survivors, and in a way, they were also conquerors. One afternoon, as they were rounding up the last of the herd, Caleb found himself staring at the old broken fence near the creek. It was the same fence he had been mending the day he saw the smoke from the shack, a simple, mundane task that had led him to an act of immeasurable consequence. The memories came back in a rush. The acrid smell of the fire, the child's whimpering that had guided him, the cold knot of dread in his stomach as he saw the scene of their suffering. He remembered the raw, desperate fear in Maya's eyes, the way she had clung to her brother, the deep bruises on her arms that had been a silent, heartbreaking testament to their pain. A wave of sorrow and anger washed over him, a powerful undertow that threatened to pull him under. He had to stop for a moment, his hand on the rough wood of the fence post, his knuckles white. The ghosts of the past, the memories he had worked so hard to bury, were now staring him in the face. It wasn't just them, he realized. He hadn't just saved them. They had saved him. They had pulled him out of the suffocating darkness of his own grief, the empty, hollow life he had been living since his wife and son's passing. They had given him a reason to live, a purpose beyond the simple day-to-day work of the ranch. He was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't notice Maya dismount her horse and walk up to him. She came to him quietly, her movements as gentle as a whisper. She put her small hand on his arm, her touch a light, grounding weight that pulled him back from the precipice of his memories. "You're thinking about it," she said, her voice soft and knowing. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, a simple, profound truth. Caleb looked down at her, a little surprised by her perception. "What do you mean?" "The way you found us," she said, her gaze fixed on the broken fence post, a shared landmark of their history. "You're thinking about how it was. We all still think about it sometimes." She met his eyes, and a depth of understanding, an empathy that belied her young age, was in them. "It's okay to remember, Caleb. It's a part of who we are, it's a part of our story." A lump formed in Caleb's throat, thick with emotion. He knelt down, pulling her into a tight, comforting hug. He wasn't the only one who had a past to contend with. The children had a far more brutal one, and yet they were still standing. They were thriving. Their scars, both visible and invisible, had become marks of their strength. "Thank you, Maya," he said, his voice a little thick. "Thank you for reminding me." The harvest continued, but now it felt different. It was no longer just about the work. It was about a shared history, about a new kind of family. It was about the slow, painful, but ultimately beautiful process of healing. That evening, as they sat around the table, the air was filled with the sense of a hearty beef stew and freshly baked bread. Maya and Leo chattered excitedly about their day, about the cattle and the chickens, about the new words they had learned from Elizabeth. Caleb watched them, a profound sense of gratitude filling his heart. This wasn't just a harvest of crops. It was a harvest of love, of trust, and of a future that was being built from the ashes of a tragic past. This was a new kind of life, and it was better than he had ever dared to hope. The tranquility of the ranch was a fragile thing, a delicate ecosystem built on the foundation of Caleb's quiet determination and the children's slow-growing trust. It was a secluded haven, but the outside world, with its relentless gossip and suspicion, had a way of seeping in, a corrosive force that threatened to unravel the peace they had so carefully built. Caleb was in town to pick up supplies, a routine chore that had become a welcome part of his life, a chance to see friendly faces and feel a part of a community. He was at the general store, his hands on a heavy sack of flour, when he first heard the whispers. He was standing near the counter, pretending to examine the goods on the shelf, when he heard two men talking in hushed, conspiratorial tones just a few feet away. "Heard that Cowboy Caleb has 2 kids living with him." One of them, a man with a sour expression named Thomas, said. "From that drifter, Jed Miller. Odd, isn't it?" "It is," the other man, a tall, lanky farmer, replied. "He's a widower, no business with kids. What's his game, you think? It's not right. A man like that taking in 2 strays." Caleb felt a cold anger building in his chest, a slow, simmering rage that threatened to boil over. He wanted to confront them, to set them straight, to tell them the truth of the children's suffering and his own intentions, but he knew it would only make things worse. He paid for his supplies in a cold, quiet fury and left the store, the whispers following him like a dark, unwelcome shadow. A few days later, Sheriff Harding showed up at the ranch. It wasn't one of his scheduled check-ins, a friendly, routine visit to ensure everything was in order. He rode up slowly, his face serious, his usual dry humor replaced by a somber, grave expression. He dismounted his horse and stood for a moment, his hands on his hips, his gaze taking in the ranch, the children playing, the well-kept corrals, the peaceful domestic scene. "Caleb," he said, his voice low and serious, "I need to talk to you. The children can stay inside." Caleb, his heart pounding in his chest, felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He knew something was wrong. He sent Maya and Leo to the house, their faces clouding over with a silent concern they had learned to read in the faces of adults. He led the sheriff to the porch, and they sat down in the quiet afternoon air, the only sound, the distant lowing of cattle. "There are rumors going around town," the sheriff began, his voice low. "People are talking about the children. They're saying you took them for some other reason, that you're not a fit guardian." Caleb's jaw tightened. He felt a fierce, protective fire burn in his gut. "I gave them a home, Sheriff. You saw how they were living." "I did," the sheriff said, nodding his head. "And I believe you, but you know how people are. They see a good man doing a good thing, and they get suspicious. You're a loner, Caleb. You kept to yourself. Now you've got a family. It's hard for people to understand." "So what do I do?" Caleb asked, his voice filled with a desperate frustration. "Do I just let them talk? Let them poison the minds of the town against me and the children?" "No," Sheriff Harding said, his eyes meeting Caleb's with a direct, unwavering gaze. "You have to show them. You have to show them that this is a real family. You can't hide them away on this ranch. You have to bring them into town. You have to let people see that they're happy and well cared for. You have to show them that you're a good father, Caleb." Caleb's stomach churned. The idea of taking the children into town, into the very place where the rumors were spreading, was terrifying. He didn't want them to hear the whispers, to feel the stares. He didn't want them to feel judged or unwelcome. He wanted to protect them from the harsh, cruel judgment of the world. But he knew the sheriff was right. They couldn't live their lives in hiding. The children deserved to be a part of a community. They deserved to be seen as more than just the rescued children, as more than just the tragic figures from a scandalous tale. Sheriff Harding stood up, his face grim. "This isn't just about the gossip, Caleb. The wrong people could hear this, and they could try to take the children from you. You have to prove them wrong, now, before it's too late." He mounted his horse, gave Caleb a final grave look, and rode off. Caleb sat on the porch for a long time, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. He looked at the house, at the place that was now their home. He knew what he had to do. He had to take them to town. He had to face the world, not just for himself, but for Maya and Leo, and for the family he was building, a family he was now willing to fight for, a family that deserved to be seen. The following Saturday, Caleb dressed the children in their best clothes. Maya wore a simple but clean blue dress that Elizabeth had helped her sew, and Leo was in a checkered shirt that was a little too big for him, but made him look like a proper young gentleman. Caleb, for his part, put on a clean shirt and his best trousers, the ones he usually reserved for special occasions. This, he knew, was a special occasion, a public statement, a fight for their place in the world. The ride into town was quiet. The children, sensing Caleb's tension, were a little subdued. They held onto his hands tightly as he led them through the dusty main street of Harmony Creek. The whispers began almost immediately, a low hum of curiosity that followed them. He felt the stares, the looks of curiosity and suspicion, the judging eyes that assessed them from head to toe. Some people, the kind, open-hearted ones, smiled and nodded, a sign of their support. But others just stared, their faces unreadable, their eyes full of a cold, judging suspicion. Caleb led them to the general store, the very place where he had first heard the rumors. The storekeeper, a kind elderly man named Mr. Abernathy, smiled warmly. "Well, Caleb, it's good to see you. And who are these two fine young people?" "Mr. Abernathy," Caleb said, his voice firm and clear, a public declaration. "This is my daughter Maya, and my son Leo." The words son and daughter felt strange on his tongue, a new and unfamiliar weight, but they also felt right. He saw the flicker of surprise in Mr. Abernathy's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a gentle smile of understanding. "It's a pleasure to meet you both," he said. He reached over the counter and handed each of them a small piece of candy, a simple act of welcome that felt like a great kindness. They continued their walk, and Caleb took them to the livery stable, to the blacksmith, and to the bakery. He introduced them to everyone he knew, and to the people he didn't. He didn't hide them away. He didn't apologize for them. He stood tall and proud, a father to his children, a man who had nothing to hide. The children, for their part, were a testament to their new life. They were clean, well-fed, and well-behaved. Leo, no longer a timid child, waved to the people who smiled at him, a small trusting smile on his face. Maya, with her usual quiet dignity, held her head high, her eyes meeting the stares of the townspeople with a quiet defiance that was a sign of her newfound strength. The most difficult encounter came when they were leaving the bakery. A group of men, the same men Caleb had overheard at the general store, were standing on the boardwalk, their faces a mixture of bravado and judgment. One of them, a loud, opinionated man named Frank, spat on the ground, a crude, insulting gesture. "Look at that, boys," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Old Caleb's turned into a family man. Heard those kids belong to that drunk Jed Miller. How much you pay for them, Cowboy?" Caleb felt a surge of rage, a hot, blinding fire that threatened to consume him, but he held it in check. He knelt down, his hand on Maya's shoulder, a silent shield. He looked at the man, his eyes a cold, hard blue. "They're not for sale, Frank," he said, his voice a low growl that was filled with a promise of violence. "And you'll watch your mouth. My children are here." The man flinched, surprised by Caleb's quiet ferocity. The other men in the group shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this was not a fight they wanted to have. Just then, a voice called out from the crowd. It was Elizabeth, who had been watching the scene unfold from a distance. She walked up to Caleb, a look of calm resolve on her face. "Mr. Caleb and his family are an inspiration to this town," she said, her voice clear and strong. "They are a testament to what a kind heart and a good home can do. If you have a problem with that, then you have a problem with decency itself." The crowd, which had been silent, began to murmur in agreement. Frank, seeing that he was outnumbered and outmatched, mumbled a curse and walked away, his bravado gone. Caleb looked at Elizabeth, a silent gratitude in his eyes. He had been so focused on protecting the children that he hadn't realized he had a community that was beginning to stand with him. The rest of the day was filled with friendly greetings and kind words. People who had once been suspicious were now smiling and nodding their heads. They had seen the truth. They had seen the love and the care. They had seen a family. As they rode home, the children chattered excitedly about their day, about the candy, and about the nice people they had met. Caleb listened, a profound sense of peace washing over him. The battle with the rumors was won. They were not just a family in their home, they were a family in the world. The first snowfall of winter transformed the ranch into a silent, white wonderland. The landscape, once a tapestry of brown and green, was now covered in a soft, thick blanket of snow that muted every sound. The air was filled with a stillness that was both beautiful and profound, a quiet that invited contemplation. The work outside became impossible. The cattle were brought in and the family was confined to the house. But the confinement didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a gift, a chance to be together, to exist in a world that was small, warm, and self-contained. The days were spent by the warm hearth, with the scent of pine and wood smoke filling the air. The fire crackled and danced, its light and warmth a living presence in the room. Caleb would mend tools and leather, his hands busy and his mind at peace. Maya would sit beside him, a book in her hands, her eyes focused on the words, her mind wandering through the stories and worlds within the pages. Leo would play with his small wooden horse, making it gallop across the wooden floor, his quiet imagination a world all its own. They were a small, self-contained world, a family in a snow globe, safe from the cold and the darkness outside. One evening, as the wind howled outside, a mournful sound that rattled the window panes, Caleb was telling them a story about his childhood, about a wild stallion he had once tried to tame. The story was a simple one, but it was filled with the kind of details that only a man who had lived a long, full life could tell. Maya, who had been listening intently, her eyes fixed on his face, asked a question that was a sign of her growing trust, a step into the past they had all tried to forget. "What was it like?" she asked, her voice soft, a fragile whisper in the quiet room. Before you found us. Was it lonely?" Caleb paused, the memories a bittersweet ache in his chest. He had been a lonely man, a man who had lost everything. "It was very lonely, Maya," he admitted, his voice low. "The world was full of silence. The house was empty. There was no laughter, no one to read to, no one to tell stories to. It was just quiet." He looked at the children, their faces a mix of sympathy and understanding. They too knew that kind of quiet. They had lived it. "We were quiet too," Maya said, her voice a whisper that was filled with a sad memory. "We were always quiet so he wouldn't get angry." She shivered and Caleb pulled her into his lap, holding her close. "We were hungry too," she continued, a new and heartbreaking detail emerging, a piece of the puzzle he had never fully understood. "Sometimes we would get so hungry that we would dream about food, about bread, and a warm place to sleep." A lump formed in Caleb's throat. The physical hunger had been obvious, a brutal reality he had seen with his own eyes. But the emotional and spiritual starvation, the constant fear and the silent existence, was something he was only now beginning to understand. "And we were scared," she said, her voice trembling. "All the time. We were so scared." Caleb held her tight, his heart aching with a profound sorrow and a fierce protectiveness. He looked at Leo, who had moved to his side and was holding his hand, his small fingers a warm presence. "You don't have to be scared anymore, Maya," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. "You don't have to be hungry anymore. You don't have to be quiet. This is your home, and this is your family, and we're never going to let anyone hurt you again." Maya buried her face in his chest, her small body trembling with a mixture of old fear and new relief. Leo climbed onto his other knee, and Caleb wrapped his arms around both of them, a human shield against the cold and the darkness outside. The wind howled, the fire crackled, and the three of them were a small island of warmth and safety in a vast, silent world. The house, which had once been a tomb of grief, was now a sanctuary of life. The winter's cold was outside, but inside, by the warm hearth, their hearts were thawing, and a new kind of family was being forged in the firelight. The spring thaw brought with it a renewed sense of life on the ranch. The snow melted into muddy rivulets, the trees began to bud, and the world seemed to be waking up from a long, cold slumber. The air, once heavy with the stillness of winter, now hummed with the promise of new life. But with the spring also came a chilling sense of dread, a cold wind that had nothing to do with the weather. Sheriff Harding rode up to the ranch one afternoon, his face grim, his posture stiff. He didn't dismount, a clear sign that this was not a social call but a professional one. He reined his horse in a few feet from the porch, his eyes meeting Caleb's with a look of grave concern. "Caleb," he said, his voice low, "Jed Miller was released from prison. Good behavior. I don't like it, but the law's the law." Caleb's stomach dropped. He felt a cold knot of dread form in his chest, a sickening feeling that the past, a thing he had fought so hard to bury, was coming back to haunt them. Did he say anything?" he asked, his voice a little hoarse. "He did," the sheriff said, his eyes meeting Caleb's with a direct, unblinking gaze. "He said he was coming back for his children. I told him he would be arrested if he set foot on this land, but he just smiled. He's a dangerous man, Caleb. He's a smart drunk and he's full of a cold, ugly kind of rage." The sheriff rode off, leaving Caleb to stare at the dusty trail, his mind racing. He had been so focused on protecting them from the outside world that he had forgotten the greatest threat to their new life was the one they had already faced. He went to the house and gathered Maya and Leo, his face a mask of quiet determination. He sat them down at the kitchen table, his voice low and serious. He didn't want to scare them, but he knew he couldn't lie. "I have to tell you something," he said, his hands on the table, his eyes fixed on their faces. "Your father, he's out of prison, and he's coming back." Leo's small face crumpled and he began to cry, his body shaking with a primal fear that was a physical manifestation of a past he couldn't remember, but that still lived in his bones. Maya, her face pale, was a study in stillness. Her eyes were wide, but she didn't cry. She just looked at Caleb, her mind racing, waiting for him to tell her what to do. Caleb pulled them into a hug, his arms a strong, protective shield. "Listen to me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "He's coming, but he won't get to you. I won't let him." He spent the next few days fortifying the ranch, a fortress against the darkness. He boarded up the windows, checked the locks on the doors, and kept his rifle close at all times. He also began to teach Maya and Leo about safety. He taught them what to do if a stranger came to the ranch, where to hide if they ever felt unsafe, and how to use a few simple tools for self-defense if they were ever in a position of peril. He taught them not with a sense of fear, but with a sense of empowerment. "I don't ever want you to have to use this," he said to Maya, handing her a small, sharp knife. "But you need to know how to protect yourself. He's a bully, Maya. He preys on fear. But you're not afraid anymore, not really." She nodded, her small hand holding the knife with a grim determination. The fear in her eyes was still there, a ghost of the past, but it was now mixed with a sense of purpose. The days passed in a tense, watchful silence. Every sound, every rustle of the wind, every creak of the floorboards was a signal of his arrival. The spring air, once so full of life and hope, was now heavy with a sense of foreboding. The ghost of Jed Miller, the man who had haunted their lives for so long, was now a very real, very present threat. Caleb knew he would come, and he was ready. He was ready to face him, not with a gun, but with the strength of a father who was willing to do whatever it took to protect his family. The night was a thick, suffocating blanket of darkness, a moonless expanse that swallowed the world whole. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and the promise of rain, a preternatural stillness that felt more like a held breath than a peaceful quiet. Inside the house, the silence was an even deeper thing, broken only by the soft, steady rhythm of Caleb's breathing. He lay in his bed, the familiar, cold weight of his rifle resting on a small table beside him. It was no longer a weapon of aggression, but a silent sentinel, a tool of protection, a testament to his unending vigilance. Sleep for Caleb was a fragile thing, a shallow rest that was easily shattered by the smallest shift in the world around him. It was this preternatural stillness that first alerted him, a break in the quiet hum of the night, a sound too light to be an animal, too deliberate to be the wind. A small, insistent hand shook his shoulder. It was Maya. Her face, a pale oval in the gloom, was a mask of pure terror. Her eyes, wide and luminous, reflected a fear he had spent years trying to erase. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice a reedy tremor that was barely audible. "He's here. I heard him." Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, a drumbeat of cold dread that echoed in his ears. He was awake in an instant, every sense on high alert, every nerve ending screaming a warning. He heard it too, the soft, almost imperceptible crunch of a boot on the gravel path leading to the house. Then came the unmistakable, heavy footfalls on the porch. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his movements silent and practiced. He grabbed his rifle, the cold steel a familiar comfort in his hands. He put a finger to his lips, a silent command for the children to stay quiet. He led them to a small, dark closet in the hallway, a space he had chosen as a makeshift panic room. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice low and firm. "No matter what happens, you don't come out. I'll be right outside the door." As he spoke, he heard the sharp, ugly tinkle of glass shattering from a back window. A moment later, a loud, splintering crack came from the back door, followed by the sound of a heavy body stumbling inside. Jed Miller was in the house. A cold, determined fury settled in Caleb's gut. He had to end this here and now. The final, brutal chapter of their old life would be written in this very room. Caleb stood in the main hallway, his rifle at the ready. He heard the man's heavy, stumbling footsteps, the sound of him lurching through the rooms, a beast on the hunt. The familiar foul smell of stale alcohol and unwashed clothes wafted through the air, an invisible miasma of pure malice. He knew this scent. It was the smell of the past, a ghost that had followed them, and he was ready to banish it for good. "Come out, Cowboy," Miller's voice slurred, a triumphant, ugly sound that echoed in the silent house. "I know you're in here. I'm taking back what's mine." His voice was a blend of drunken bravado and cold, simmering hatred. "They're not yours, Jed," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that filled the hallway. "They're home, and you're trespassing." Miller stumbled into the hallway, a dark, menacing shadow in the gloom. He held a rusty iron bar in his hand, a crude but effective weapon. His eyes, though bloodshot and bleary, held a cold, venomous glare. He lunged at Caleb, a half-crazed look in his eyes, driven by a raw, unthinking rage. He was bigger than Caleb, and heavier, but his movements were clumsy, and Caleb was faster. He dodged the first blow, a wild swing that would have crushed his skull, the iron bar whistling through the air inches from his face. In that fraction of a second, Caleb brought the butt of his rifle down on Miller's wrist with a sickening crack. Miller screamed in pain, a high animal sound, and the iron bar clattered to the floor. Miller, a man fueled by a lifetime of resentment and a fresh dose of drink, lunged at Caleb again, but Caleb was ready. He tackled him, bringing him to the ground with a loud thud that shook the house. The two men wrestled on the floor, their grunts and struggles filling the silent house. Miller, a brutal opponent, fought dirty. He kneed Caleb in the gut, a sharp, searing fire that spread through his belly, and Caleb gasped in pain, but he held on, his hands clasped around Miller's throat, his body a solid weight on top of him. He was no longer just a man fighting another man. He was a father fighting for his children. He was a protector fighting for his family. "You're not going to win, Jed," Caleb said, his voice strained and hoarse. "You're not taking them. Not ever again." Miller's struggles began to weaken, his rage being replaced by a helpless fury. His eyes were wide with a terror he had never known, and he gasped for breath, his face turning a dark, mottled red. Caleb held on, his hands a vice, but not to kill him. He just needed to subdue him. He held him until Miller's body went limp, his consciousness fading in and out. Then, with a great final effort, he got up panting and tied Miller's hands with a piece of rope he had grabbed from the hallway table, a silent, efficient act that was the final humiliation for the defeated man. He looked at the closet, his heart still hammering against his ribs. "It's over," he said, his voice trembling a little with emotion. "You can come out now." The closet door opened, and Maya and Leo emerged, their faces streaked with tears, their eyes wide with fear and relief. They looked at the man on the floor, his body limp and defeated, and then they looked at Caleb. He was bruised and battered, his body sore, his clothes torn, but he was standing. He was their protector. He was their hero. He knelt down, his arms open, and pulled them into a tight embrace. The storm outside began to rage, the wind howling and the rain lashing against the windows, but inside, in the quiet, still center of the house, a different kind of peace had been won. The final brutal chapter of their old life was over, and the new one, the one they were building together, could finally begin. The morning light, filtered through the shattered window, fell in a pale, dusty shaft, illuminating the brutal aftermath of the night's battle. The room was a mess of broken glass and splintered wood, a battlefield of a family's fight for survival. Caleb sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his body sore, his knuckles scraped and bruised, but otherwise unharmed. Jed Miller was unconscious, a pathetic and defeated figure tied to a chair in the middle of the room, his head slumped to his chest. He was no longer a monster, a figure of pure evil, but a man, a weak, broken man who had gambled and lost, his fury and his hate finally extinguished by a force greater than his own. Caleb sent Maya and Leo to the barn to get the sheriff, a chore that now felt less like a duty and more like a triumph, a final, victorious act. As they ran, their small feet pounding against the ground, their laughter a soft and joyful sound, Caleb felt a profound sense of peace. The children were free and they were safe, their freedom a tangible thing in the cool morning air. When Sheriff Harding arrived, his face was grim, a mixture of concern and grim resolve. He took in the scene with a practiced eye, his gaze moving from the shattered glass to the unconscious man tied to the chair, and then finally to Caleb, his eyes asking the silent question. "He came back," the sheriff said, his voice a low rumble. "He did," Caleb said, his voice tired but firm, "and he won't be coming back again." Sheriff Harding didn't say anything. He just looked at Jed Miller, his face a mask of disappointment and disgust. He knew that this was a man who had squandered his last chance, a man who had chosen a path of violence and destruction over a path of redemption. He arrested him, a quiet, somber act that felt less like a triumph of the law and more like a final, sad piece of a tragedy. As he was leading him away, Jed looked at the children, his eyes full of a cold, impotent hatred. But they didn't flinch. They just stared at him, their faces impassive. They were no longer afraid of him. They were free, their small bodies a living testament to their new life. The days that followed were a blur of activity and quiet healing. Caleb patched up the house, mending the broken window and repairing the door, his movements a testament to his resolve. He worked with a quiet purpose, his hands once so used to the loneliness of ranch life, now moving with a newfound sense of urgency and meaning. Elizabeth came to help, bringing food and bandages for Caleb's cuts and bruises. She didn't ask for details. She just took care of him, her quiet presence a great comfort, a silent promise of her love and support. The children, for their part, were a testament to their resilience. They were shaken by the event, but they were also a little bit changed. The old fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce certainty that they were safe. They had seen Caleb fight for them. and they knew in their hearts that he would do it again, that he was their protector, their guardian, their rock. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, the children quietly playing a game of checkers, their small hands moving the pieces across the board, Maya spoke, her voice a small whisper in the quiet room. "He's gone, isn't he?" "He is," Caleb said, his hand on her shoulder, his touch a silent reassurance. "He's not going to bother us again." She nodded, and then, for the first time since the night of the confrontation, she smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it was real. It was a glimmer of light in the darkness, a promise of a new beginning, a testament to the new life they were building. The conversation with Elizabeth that night was more intimate than any they had shared before. She sat with him on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and they watched the stars, a vast, silent testament to the endlessness of the universe. The air was cool and crisp, and the sound of the crickets chirping was a gentle rhythm. "You're a good man, Caleb," she said, her voice soft, her words a quiet affirmation. "A really good man." Caleb looked at her, his heart filled with a profound gratitude. "I just did what I had to do," he said, his voice a quiet shrug. "No," she said, her voice firm. "You did what you wanted to do. You chose to help them. You chose to be their father. You chose to be a good man." Caleb looked at her, and in the quiet moonlight he felt a new kind of warmth, a new kind of hope. The nightmare of the past was truly over. The last of the shadows had been banished, and in their place a new and beautiful future was beginning to unfold. The journey had been long and it had been difficult, but it had led him to this moment, to this quiet night and to this new, unexpected and wonderful family. He was a man who had once been broken, but he was now whole, his heart filled to the brim with a love he never thought he would find again. The final brutal confrontation with Jed Miller was the last hurdle, the final battle that sealed their new life and set the course for their future. In the months that followed, the ranch became more than just a home. It became a beacon of hope in the community. The townspeople, once so suspicious, now embraced Caleb and his family with open arms, their kindness a warm and constant presence. The children were a common sight in town, and their happy, confident faces were a testament to Caleb's love and care. They were living proof that a good home and a kind heart could heal the deepest of wounds, and their story was whispered from one neighbor to the next, a legend in the making. Elizabeth's visits became more frequent, and their relationship deepened into something profound and meaningful, a quiet understanding that didn't require many words. Their conversations moved from lessons and ranch life to a quiet, tentative sharing of their hearts, their hopes, and their dreams. They would talk for hours, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, their voices low and their words filled with a lifetime of experience. She would tell him about her life, about the books she had read and the places she had dreamed of going. He would tell her about his own life, about the land and the cattle, and about the quiet sorrow he had carried for so long. One evening, after the children were asleep, their small rhythmic breathing a soft lullaby, Caleb walked her to her wagon, the air cool and filled with the sweet scent of wildflowers. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice a little hoarse with emotion, the words catching in his throat, "I don't know what I would have done without you. You've brought so much light to our lives." She smiled, a soft, beautiful smile that reached her eyes. "You did that, Caleb. You brought the light. I just helped them find their way to it." He looked at her, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude, but also a deeper, more complicated emotion, a love that had been born not of a passionate fire, but of a quiet, enduring respect, a bond forged in mutual understanding and shared purpose. He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm, a silent question in his grasp. "I'm not a solitary man anymore," he said. "I have a family. And I think I'd like that family to grow a little bigger." Elizabeth's eyes welled up with tears, and she squeezed his hand, her own fingers tightening around his. "I would like that too, Caleb. Very much." The seasons turned, and the family grew. Elizabeth moved to the ranch, and her presence filled the house with a warmth and a gentle joy that had been missing for so long. She would hum as she worked, her voice a soft, constant sound that echoed through the rooms. She would bake bread that filled the house with a comforting aroma, and she would read stories to the children by the firelight, her voice a soothing balm. She and Caleb were married in a quiet, simple ceremony in town, with Sheriff Harding as the witness and the children standing proudly at their side. It was a day of quiet celebration, a testament to the fact that love, in its truest form, was a quiet, steady thing that could grow in the most unexpected of places, a beautiful and resilient force. Maya and Leo were thriving, their old fears a distant memory. They were no longer just survivors. They were happy, confident, and loved children. They had a home, a father, and a new mother, and their hearts, once so bruised, were now filled with a sense of security and belonging. They had a future that was no longer a grim question, but a bright and hopeful promise. They were no longer the lost, frightened children of the past, but the resilient, hopeful children of the present. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in a brilliant tapestry of red and gold, Caleb sat on the porch. The world was at peace, and the air was filled with the soft sounds of a life lived well. The creak of his rocking chair was a gentle rhythm, a melody of contentment. Maya and Leo were playing a game of marbles on the floor beside him, their laughter a sweet and constant sound that filled the twilight air. Elizabeth sat beside him, her hand in his, a silent presence that was more comforting than any words could ever be. Caleb looked out over his land, over the vast expanse of the plains, and he felt a profound sense of peace. He had found his purpose in the most unexpected of places. He had lost one family, but he had found another. And in that he had found a kind of grace he never thought possible. He was a man who had once been broken, but he was now whole, his heart overflowing with a love that had been a long time coming. He looked at his children, his beautiful, resilient children, and at the woman he loved. The journey had been long, filled with pain and loss and sorrow, but it had led them here, to a place of safety, of love, and of a future that was for the first time a promise. The story of the widowed cowboy and the rescued children was no longer a story of sorrow. It was a story of hope. It was a story of a new beginning. It was a story of a family, forever and always. The years passed like the turning of the seasons, each one bringing its own changes and new life to the ranch. 6 years had gone by since the night of the final confrontation with Jed Miller, and the land, once a place of quiet grief, now vibrated with a vibrant, bustling life. The cattle herds had grown, the fences were strong, and the house, once so stark and empty, was now filled with the warmth of a family and the promise of a future. The scars of the past, once raw and open, had faded into a quiet testament of their resilience. Maya, now a young woman of 16, was no longer the small guarded girl Caleb had found. She had blossomed into a young woman of quiet grace and sharp intelligence, her mind as quick and agile as a deer in the brush. Her hair, once a matted tangle, was now a beautiful cascade of light brown, and her eyes, once clouded with fear, held a clear, thoughtful light, a reflection of the peace she had found. She had surpassed even Elizabeth's lessons, and was now helping her with the younger children in the growing community. Her patience and empathy a gift to every child she guided. She was the one who had once needed a safe place to land, and now she was the one providing it for others, a living testament to the power of a single act of kindness. Leo, a sturdy boy of 12, had grown tall and strong, his body a reflection of the hard work and good food he had known. He was Caleb's shadow, learning every aspect of ranch life, from the early morning mending of fences to the late-night vigil over a calving cow. He could ride a horse with a practiced ease, his body moving in a fluid rhythm with the animal. He could mend a fence with his own hands, his muscles now strong from the work. He could handle the cattle with a quiet confidence that belied his age, his gentle voice a comfort to the skittish animals. The frail, frightened boy who had once trembled at a loud sound was now a dependable young man, his laughter a constant and joyful sound around the ranch. It was a sound that filled Caleb's heart with a warmth that rivaled the midday sun. Caleb and Elizabeth's marriage had settled into a comfortable, enduring love. Their bond was not one of youthful fire, but of a deep and profound companionship built on shared purpose and a mutual understanding of life's hardships. They worked together, side by side, building their home and their family, their quiet partnership a testament to their resilience. Their love was a deep, steady river, flowing through the landscape of their shared life. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and pink, a letter arrived. It was from a school in Oklahoma City, a proper school for young women, the kind of place Maya had only ever read about. A benefactor who had heard of Maya's story, a tale that had spread far and wide, had offered her a scholarship, a chance to get a formal education and pursue her dream of becoming a teacher. Caleb read the letter aloud, his voice a little shaky with emotion. The words, so formal and precise, felt immense in the quiet room. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Maya's face was a mixture of awe and trepidation. The girl who had once been afraid to leave a shack was now being asked to leave the only home she had ever truly known, to venture into a world that was both a promise and a threat. "It's a wonderful opportunity, Maya," Elizabeth said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and a gentle sadness. Maya looked at Caleb, her eyes searching his for a sign, for a hint of what he was thinking. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to leave you." "I don't want to leave Leo or the ranch." Caleb's heart ached with a mixture of pride and fear. He had spent so long protecting her, so long fighting to keep her safe, that the thought of her leaving, of her venturing out into the world alone, was terrifying. But he knew this was a moment he had to face. He had to be a father, not just a protector. He put an arm around her, his touch a silent reassurance. "You're a part of this family, Maya. You always will be. But this isn't just a ranch. It's a place where we grow things, and sometimes those things need to be planted in new soil to truly flourish. This is your chance to flourish, honey." He looked at her, and his eyes, which had seen so much sorrow, were now filled with a quiet love that was as deep and vast as the plains. "I'm not just the man who saved you anymore, Maya. I'm your father, and a father's job isn't to hold his children back, it's to help them reach for the stars." Maya's eyes welled up with tears, and she hugged him tight, her body a testament to the love and security he had given her. It was a difficult decision, a painful one, but it was also a joyous one. It was a testament to the incredible journey they had been on, a journey that had started with a lonesome cowboy and 2 frightened children, and was now leading them to a future they never could have imagined. The seeds of their tomorrow were being sown. The old wounds were healed, but they were not forgotten. They were a part of who they were, a reminder of the strength and love that had brought them to this moment. They were a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a glimmer of hope, a fragile thread of light that can lead you home. The years that followed were filled with both a sweeping tide of change and a steadfast, unshakable sense of belonging. The quiet, stoic cowboy and the 2 rescued children had become a local legend, their story a powerful reminder of the deep well of compassion that existed in the human heart. The old town gossip, once a sharp and bitter thing, had faded away, replaced by a quiet respect and a profound admiration for the man who had turned a desolate patch of land into a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of a loving home. Maya, with a mind as sharp as a newly forged blade, eventually left for school in the city. Her departure a mixture of excitement and the familiar, quiet fear of the unknown. She returned every summer, and during holidays, her letters a vivid tapestry of a new world she was exploring. She wrote of her classes, not just the names of the subjects, but the way history felt like a living thing, and mathematics a beautiful, intricate puzzle. She wrote of her friends, a diverse cast of characters who had been drawn to her quiet strength. And she wrote of the dreams she was building for her future, dreams that were no longer just about survival, but about thriving, about building something of her own. She was no longer a victim of a cruel past, but the author of her own story, her pen a powerful instrument of her own destiny. Leo, in turn, grew into a man who was both a mirror of Caleb and a reflection of the love that had shaped him. He had Caleb's quiet strength and determination, his calloused hands and his steady gaze, but he also had an openness and a joy that came from a life lived in peace, a freedom from the shadows that had once haunted his childhood. He worked the ranch with a quiet pride, expanding the cattle operation and bringing new life and prosperity to the land. He had a natural understanding of the rhythm of the seasons and the needs of the animals, a knowledge that had been passed down to him not through blood, but through love. The community had fully embraced them, their silent support a constant, reassuring presence. Neighbors would ride over not just to help, but to sit and talk, to share a cup of coffee and a moment of quiet camaraderie. The story of the widowed cowboy and the rescued children had become a local legend, a tale told by the firelight to remind people of the power of compassion, a story that was whispered from one generation to the next. Elizabeth, with the help of the town, finally built the schoolhouse she had always dreamed of. It was a solid wooden building, a testament to her vision and the community's dedication. It was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the quiet rustle of turning pages, and the promise of a brighter future for all. Maya, on her return from the city, would often come to the schoolhouse to help, her presence a living testament to the power of education and kindness, a symbol of the bright future she was helping to build for others. On a warm summer evening, with the sky ablaze in a final, glorious sunset of crimson and gold, the family sat on the porch. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wild sage, and the sound of crickets chirping was a gentle counterpoint to the quiet peace. Caleb, his hair now a silver grey that matched the wisdom in his eyes, sat in his old rocking chair, its rhythmic creak a comforting sound. His arm was around Elizabeth, their lives intertwined in a love that was quiet, profound, and born of a shared purpose. Leo, a grown man with a quiet confidence that was as solid as the land he worked, sat on the steps, his own son, a boy of 3, playing with a small wooden horse he had whittled himself, a living echo of the one he had clutched so tightly as a child. Maya, home for the summer, was sitting beside her little brother, her eyes filled with a peaceful contentment, a sense of belonging that had once seemed impossible. Caleb looked out over his land, over the vast expanse of the plains, a sight that had once filled him with a sense of immense loneliness, but now filled him with a profound sense of peace. His eyes settled on the small, humble gravesite under the old oak tree, the place where Sarah and Jacob rested. The ache of their loss was no longer a fresh wound, but a quiet, tender memory, a part of him that was now intertwined with the joy of his new life. He had honored them not by living in the past, but by building a new life filled with love, a life that was a testament to their memory. He looked at the family he had found, the one he had built from a place of sorrow and pain, from the ashes of his past. They were his testament, his living legacy. His heart, once a barren wasteland, was now a garden, overflowing with love and life. Leo's son, his grandson, ran to him and climbed onto his lap, his small body a warm weight, a small perfect circle of life. Caleb held him close, his heart filled to the brim, a final, beautiful affirmation of his journey. The journey had been long, but it had led them to this moment, to this quiet evening, to this final unbroken circle of love. The story of the widowed cowboy was not just a story of a rescue. It was a story of a man who had lost everything, but who had against all odds found a new family, a new purpose and a new life. And in that, he had found his home, forever and always.